March 7, 1945. Remagen, Germany. 3 hours before dawn, the artillery had gone quiet. In the basement of a half-collapsed apartment building near the Ludendorff Bridge, Frau Kessler sat pressed against a concrete wall, her infant daughter clutched to her chest. Dust floated in soft, steady streams from the cracked ceiling above, caught in the pale light of distant fires outside. The child was silent, too weak to cry, and that silence terrified her mother more than the shelling ever had. She knew the Americans were coming. She had heard the rumors, the horror stories told in whispers and shouted through radio speakers for 12 years. The Ministry of Propaganda had built a clear picture. The Americans were not men, but savages. They would violate women, butcher children, dismantle what was left of the Reich brick by brick. Jazz-listening, gum-chewing, race-mixing degenerates who knew nothing of honor or culture. That was the image Frau Kessler had grown up with. That was what she believed. The sound of boots on rubble overhead sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Her arms tightened around her daughter's frail body, more cloth and bone now than flesh. The baby hadn't gained weight since January. Milk had run out weeks ago. Bread, when it came, was mostly sawdust. She had no food left, no husband, no country, really, just fear. And then the basement door creaked open. A flashlight beam cut across the ruined cellar. Women flinched. One child whimpered, and into the space stepped a man. A silhouette at first, rifle slung back, voice low, posture unthreatening. His name was Private Joseph Hendricks, 22 years old, from rural Pennsylvania. He had landed at Omaha Beach, fought through Normandy, watched friends die in forests and fields from German bullets. But what Frau Kessler saw was not hatred, not vengeance. She saw confusion, maybe pity. Private Hendricks swept his flashlight slowly across the room, then reached into his pack and produced a small can. Condensed milk. He held it out toward her and gestured gently to the child in her arms. She froze. To accept anything from the enemy was to betray everything she had been taught. But the baby in her arms wasn't a theory. She was dying, and propaganda could not feed an infant. With shaking hands, she took the can. Within minutes, more Americans entered. One carried chocolate. Another passed out bread, cheese, and canned meat. They weren't shouting orders. They weren't rough. They knelt. They smiled. They offered food like neighbors, not conquerors. Private Hendricks stepped forward again. This time, he reached out. Not for her hand, but for her daughter. She recoiled at first, instinctively. Then she looked into his face, and for reasons she wouldn't fully understand until years later, she handed him the child. He cradled the baby gently, carefully, as if she were his own. That moment, the quiet transfer of a starving infant from a German mother to an American soldier, wasn't just a scene of war. It was a collapse, of ideology, of fear, of lies told too many times by too many people who had never lifted a can of milk. This happened across Germany. In towns like Remagen, Cologne, and Koblenz, in ruins and rubble, under broken ceilings and cracked walls, German civilians braced for monsters, and instead met young men who carried rations in one hand and compassion in the other. For Frau Kessler, the Reich didn't fall when Berlin burned. It fell in that basement, with one flashlight, one can, one child. Frau Kessler's decision to hand over her daughter didn't end the war, but for her, it ended something else, something deeper. The fear, the certainty, the belief that mercy would never come. And she wasn't alone. As the Ninth Armored Division pushed deeper into the Rhineland, they encountered towns full of civilians who had been left behind. Women, children, and the elderly, those the regime had sworn to protect, and then abandoned. They huddled in basements, cellars, bombed out homes, terrified of the Americans, prepared for violence, humiliation, and retribution. But what came instead was confusion, kindness, food. In Remagen, after Hendricks carried Greta to safety, his sergeant made a call that would echo across Germany in the coming weeks. Evacuate the civilians, not because they were ordered to, because it was the right thing to do. The war wasn't over yet. German snipers still fired from rooftops. Mines littered the streets, but even in the chaos, American soldiers paused to help. It wasn't just rations they gave, it was recognition. Private Hendricks had grown up during the Great Depression. Hunger was not an abstract idea to him. He had known empty plates and long winters. When he saw hollow eyes and paper-thin children, it didn't matter what language they spoke or what uniform their fathers had worn. He saw need, and he responded the only way he knew how. This instinct rippled outward. Word spread quickly among American units. There are civilians in the ruins. Women. Kids. They're starving. No one needed to explain what to do. Soldiers shared their rations. Medics treated wounds. Engineers cleared rubble to reach trapped families. There was no directive from Eisenhower to do this. In fact, official policy at the time still warned against fraternization. But compassion doesn't wait for orders. What began in basements like Frau Kessler's became a pattern. In village after village, soldiers gave more than just supplies. They gave care. And every act chipped away at the edifice the Reich had built. Propaganda repeated so long it had become doctrine that Americans were monsters, destroyers, beasts. Instead, they came carrying condensed milk and chocolate bars. The emotional collision was immense. Women who had been warned for years to fear the sound of English now found themselves sitting beside American medics, watching as their children were fed and treated. Babies who should have died were being saved. Toddlers were lifted onto soldiers' shoulders to cross debris-strewn streets. Elderly women were helped down collapsed staircases by men who, weeks earlier, might have shot at their sons on the battlefield. The stories multiplied, and each one told the same truth. The Americans were not who the Reich had said they were. For many Germans, this was the first real break in the spell. Not a military defeat, but a moral one. And not inflicted with bombs or tanks, but with bread and human decency. It's hard to overstate how devastating that realization was. If they had lied about the Americans, what else had they lied about? If the enemy had shown more compassion in victory than their own government had in power, who were the real monsters? In Tabitsi, that way, Private Hendricks did more than carry a baby. He helped carry the weight of a crumbling ideology. And he did it not with speeches or politics, but with his arms and with mercy. By late March 1945, the American advance into Western Germany had become not just a military movement, but an unintended humanitarian mission. Town after town revealed the same story. Civilians surviving in the hollowed-out husks of buildings, subsisting on ration scraps, their belief in the Reich's promises reduced to rubble around them. And yet, what shocked many Germans wasn't the destruction. It was the abundance the Americans carried with them. Each American GI seemed to have more food in his backpack than entire families had seen in months. Chocolate bars, real coffee, white bread, canned meat, condensed milk. The things German civilians had only heard of in propaganda, described as symbols of chaos and corruption, were now feeding their children. And those items weren't reserved for officers. They were standard rations, shared freely. The Reich had spent years portraying America as decadent, disorganized, weak. But here were American troops operating with precision, arriving in tanks that hadn't run out of fuel, wearing boots that hadn't fallen apart, handing out food that hadn't been diluted into nothing. Even the smallest things contradicted the propaganda. Cigarettes with real tobacco, not sawdust. Chocolate that didn't taste like glue. Every meal shared became a silent statement. Everything they told you was a lie. The German war machine had required sacrifices, especially from civilians. Food rationing had begun in 1939. By 1945, cities like Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz were on the edge of famine. The Reich had fed the military first and left civilians to starve. Mothers diluted milk, mixed flour with sawdust, waited in lines for hours only to be told there was nothing left. And when it mattered most, the system vanished. Nazi officials fled. Supply chains broke down. The promised protection never arrived. The Americans did, and they didn't come with banners or boasts. They came carrying crates. GI mess sergeants doubled their workload, cooking for more mouths than they had ever trained for. Medical tents, built for wounded soldiers, filled with malnourished civilians. Engineers repaired water mains, not for military gain, but because children were drinking from puddles. None of this was official policy. In fact, the early Allied approach to post-war Germany had been punitive. The Morgenthau Plan proposed turning Germany into a pastoral state, stripped of its industry, its power, and its future. No fraternization was printed in handbooks and drilled into every briefing. Soldiers were told not to trust Germans, not to help them, not to forget what they had done. But something deeper was at work. American soldiers weren't trained humanitarians. They were ordinary young men raised in a culture where neighbors helped each other, where kindness was not a strategy but a value, where democracy, for all its contradictions, still taught that every person had worth. So they ignored the guidelines, or interpreted them loosely. They fed civilians because they remembered what hunger felt like. They carried babies because that's what you did when a baby needed carrying. They didn't wait for permission. They acted, and those acts, those small, repeated gestures, did something that propaganda and politics could never accomplish. They proved, in real time, that democracy worked. That compassion wasn't weakness. That power could coexist with mercy. The Reich had built its identity on strength without empathy. It had promised dominance, discipline, and purity. The Americans arrived with chewing gum and jazz music and saved lives. Which one, the civilians began to ask, was truly civilized? In the weeks that followed the crossing of the Rhine, something remarkable happened, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the people. The Nazi regime had worked relentlessly to define identity through opposition. Germans were strong because others were weak. They were civilized because others were degenerate. They were superior because others were inferior. The American soldier was supposed to be the ultimate proof of that narrative, a chaotic, immoral symbol of everything Germany rejected. And yet, in village after village, the opposite proved true. German civilians began to see the American GI not as a conqueror, but as a contradiction. He didn't fit the story. He didn't pillage. He didn't brutalize. He didn't sneer. He handed out candy. He helped rebuild bridges. He carried children. What began as shock turned slowly into something else, respect. And in time, something even more radical, trust. This psychological shift happened quietly. There were no parades, no speeches, but when German mothers stepped aside to let American medics treat their children, when shopkeepers emerged to sweep rubble from roads used by American convoys, When fathers risked punishment to translate between GIs and their neighbors, something had clearly broken. It wasn't just that the Americans had disproved the propaganda, it was that the propaganda no longer held power. Nowhere was this clearer than in the contrast between the western and eastern zones. As the Soviets pushed in from the east, they brought vengeance with them, often justified by the unimaginable brutality the Nazis had unleashed on the Soviet Union. Civilians in the Soviet zone experienced the very kind of occupation they had been taught to fear: violent, punishing, and merciless. But in the West, under American control, the occupation evolved into something different. Reconstruction replaced retribution. Compassion displaced ideology. The Americans, while not perfect, acted with a restraint that Germans hadn't even thought possible in war. Frau Kessler's cousins lived in Brandenburg under Soviet control. Their letters, when they arrived, were filled with fear. Soviet soldiers had taken their food, their valuables, their safety. In contrast, Frau Kessler could walk with Greta to the American aid station, eat warm meals at the mess hall, and speak with American nurses who asked about her child's health. Not her politics. For civilians who had never questioned the Nazi narrative, this reversal was dizzying. If Americans weren't monsters, then what had they been fighting for? If these men, raised in a democracy, often from mixed backgrounds, often skeptical of authority, had won the war and still chosen mercy, then perhaps everything they had been taught about race, strength, and nation was not just wrong, but evil. It was not easy to admit, but the truth had become undeniable. The American soldier didn't carry ideology. He carried food, and sometimes medicine, and sometimes a baby through a destroyed street. And he carried with him the unshakable message that the Reich had lied, not just about the enemy, but about what it meant to be human. That transformation, quiet, gradual, personal, was more powerful than any directive from Berlin or Washington. It happened not through force, but through example. The GI did not demand obedience. He inspired reflection, and for many Germans, especially mothers like Frau Kessler, it was the moment they stopped seeing Americans as the enemy and started wondering what it meant to be free. Frau Kessler never forgot the moment she placed her baby in the arms of an American soldier. For her, that single act, driven by desperation, accepted with trembling hope, marked the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. Her daughter, Greta, survived. She gained weight, learned to crawl in an American-run displaced persons center set up inside what had once been a Wehrmacht barracks. She drank formula made from American condensed milk, wrapped in blankets donated by GIs. And though she would never remember it, her story became a cornerstone of her mother's life, told again and again, each time with the same quiet awe. He didn't hate us. He helped us. Private Joseph Hendricks never saw them again. He returned to Pennsylvania in December 1945, married his sweetheart, and went back to farming. When asked about the war, he rarely spoke of battles, but he spoke of a baby, a German baby, one he carried through rubble because no one else could. When a German film crew tracked him down in the 1980s and asked why he had helped, his answer was simple. She was a baby. You help babies. That simplicity held power, because it revealed a truth the Reich had never grasped, that decency does not require permission, that strength and mercy are not opposites, that the most powerful nation in the world had chosen to temper victory not with vengeance, but with compassion, and in doing so, it changed everything. German civilians, watching their cities rebuilt with American help, listening to American jazz on GI radios, lining up at American-run food stations, began to see democracy not as chaos, but as a system capable of producing abundance and grace. They saw soldiers who gave freely, who showed kindness to children, who helped enemies without asking for anything in return. They saw a future. Not immediately, not easily, but the shift had begun. The Reich had promised greatness and delivered rubble. It had spoken of purity and brought genocide. It had demanded loyalty and abandoned its people to starve. The Americans, whom the regime had painted as degenerate and dangerous, had saved their children. That contradiction didn't just undermine Nazi ideology. It dismantled it, because propaganda is fragile. It needs distance. It needs fear. It collapses when a mother watches her child being fed by the hands of someone she was taught to hate, and realizes that the hate was manufactured, the fear manipulated, the enemy imagined. Greta Kessler grew up in West Germany. She became a schoolteacher like her mother. She lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall. Her sons were born into a country that had chosen democracy, chosen freedom, chosen to remember. Not just the horrors it had supported, but the mercy it had been shown. And in classrooms across the country, children learned a different story of 1945, one that didn't end with conquest, but with compassion. The legacy of those acts, the chocolate bars shared, the babies carried, the food offered without condition, cannot be measured in medals or treaties. It lives in memory, in gratitude, in the quiet rebuilding of trust between nations once at war. The American soldier didn't just help win the war. He helped win the future. Not by force, but by showing that kindness, even in the rubble, could plant something stronger than fear. Hope. If this story moved you, if you believe compassion is stronger than cruelty, and that history has lessons we must never forget, share this video. Leave a comment below and tell us what resonated with you. Subscribe for more true stories that reveal the humanity behind history. And if this gave you hope, give it a like. It tells the algorithm this story matters.